I want you to close your eyes for a second and try to visualize a timeline. Picture the United States in 1924.
Okay.
We're talking about the height of the Jazz Age. Calvin Coolidge is in the White House. Flappers are dancing the Charleston. Prohibition is in full swing, so, everyone is drinking bootleg gin in teacups.
Right. The world is black and white. It's grainy.
It's grainy, and it moves at a different speed. It feels like a completely different planet compared to today.
Oh, absolutely.
Now, keep that image in your head and just fast forward, keep going. Past the Great Depression, past World War II.
A huge amount of history.
Past the Korean War. Through the Kennedy assassination, the moon landing, the civil rights movement, all the way to 1972.
Wow.
Richard Nixon is in the White House. The Vietnam War is raging. Watergate is just starting to bubble up. The world is in color now. It's loud, it's angry, and it's modern.
That is a span of 48 years, nearly half a century.
And for that entire time, every single day of those 48 years, one man sat at the same desk, heading the same agency, effectively holding the highest office of law enforcement in the country.
J. Edgar Hoover.
We are talking, of course, about J. Edgar Hoover.
The first director of the FBI.
And honestly, for a long time, he simply was the FBI. You can't really separate the man from the institution.
That's what we're doing today. We are doing a deep dive into the life, the massive empire, and the really disturbing secrets of J. Edgar Hoover.
Yeah.
And looking at the source material we've told, the biographies, the declassified memos, the history books. The thing that hits me is the sheer impossibility of his survival.
Right.
In modern politics, an FBI director or a cabinet member lasts, 2 years? 3?
If they're lucky. It's a burnout job. But Hoover served under 8 different presidents.
8 of them.
Coolidge, Hoover, Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon. Democrats, Republicans, liberals, conservatives, it didn't matter. They all came into office, and J. Edgar Hoover was already there, waiting for them. And he usually stayed long after they were gone. But here is the tension I want to explore today, because the sources present us with a massive contradiction. On one hand, you have the great modernizer, the guy who took law enforcement out of the Stone Age, introduced science, fingerprints, professional standards. He's the reason we have the modern concept of a federal agent.
Absolutely. But then you have the shadow. The man who built a personal secret police force. The man who wiretapped Martin Luther King Jr., who blackmailed politicians, who kept secret files on anyone who dared to criticize him.
It's the ultimate paradox, isn't it? The man who represented the rule of law more than anyone else in America, while simultaneously running an operation that violated the law almost daily.
That's the mission of this deep dive, really, to understand how those two things coexisted in one person, in one career. And I think to do that, we have to look at Hoover not just as a cop, but as an architect.
An architect.
Yeah. He built a machine designed to impose order on the country. And for Hoover, order was a very specific, very personal thing.
Well, let's go back to the blueprint then. To understand the machine, you have to understand where the architect came from. And J. Edgar Hoover was a Washington creature in a way that very few people are, right?
Oh, born and bred. He was born on New Year's Day, 1895, right in Washington, D.C., in a house on Capitol Hill.
His whole life.
Lived in D.C. his entire life. He never really left. But there is this one weird detail in the vital records that the sources point out.
Oh, the birth certificate thing.
Yeah. There was no birth certificate filed when he was born.
Which is odd. I mean, for anyone, but especially for him.
It is very odd. It wasn't filed until 1938. He was 43 years old, the most famous lawman in the world, before his birth was officially registered on paper.
That is deeply ironic for a man who's been his entire life obsessed with paperwork and verifying identities.
It really is. And that obsession with the record, with documentation, it starts early. You know, we often think of Hoover as a tough guy or a prosecutor, but his first real job, the one that I think shaped his brain, was at the Library of Congress.
Wait, he was a librarian?
Yeah.
Seriously?
He was a messenger and then a cataloger. He started at age 18. And you have to understand, this wasn't just shelving books. This was the era before computers.
Right.
The Library of Congress was trying to organize the sum total of human knowledge using index cards.
The Dewey Decimal System on a massive scale.
Exactly. But think about the mechanics of that. You have millions of books, and you need a system where you can find any specific piece of information within seconds. It requires a rigid, logical, hierarchical system.
And he loved it.
He loved it. He excelled at it. He later wrote that this job trained him in the value of collating material.
So While other young men are maybe out learning a trade or studying philosophy, Hoover is learning how to turn the world into a database.
He viewed intelligence as data to be cataloged. And if you look at the FBI later, the massive indices, the cross-referencing files, the way they track people, it's all just an aggressive expansion of the library card catalog.
That makes so much sense.
He saw people not as human beings with rights, but as entries in a system. If an entry is in the wrong place, or if it doesn't fill the category, it's disorder, and you have to fix it.
He's trying to organize the chaos of human behavior. Now, speaking of chaos, he had a personal battle with chaos in his own body, didn't he? The stutter.
Right. As a child, he had a debilitating stutter. And for a boy who valued control and precision, not being able to speak clearly must have been torture.
I can't even imagine.
But the way he fixed it tells you everything about his personality. He didn't go to therapy. It didn't really exist like that back then. He taught himself to speak with what biographers describe as ferocious speed.
Ferocious speed. What does that mean exactly?
He would talk so fast that the stutter couldn't catch up with him. It was a machine gun delivery, staccato, rapid fire.
Wow.
Later in his career, stenographers complained they couldn't type fast enough to document his speeches. He turned a vulnerability into a weapon. He literally overwhelmed people with words.
So you have a guy who talks like a machine gun and thinks like a card catalog. He gets his law degree from George Washington University, and in 1917, he enters the Department of Justice.
And the timing is crucial. 1917, World War I.
Right.
The government is in a panic about spies, about saboteurs, about foreigners. Hoover lands in the War Emergency Division.
And specifically, he heads up the Alien Enemy Bureau, which, I have to say, sounds like something out of a sci-fi dystopian novel.
It does, doesn't it? But it was very real. President Wilson had authorized the arrest and jailing of disloyal foreigners without trial.
And Hoover's what, 22?
22 years old, fresh out of law school, and suddenly he has the authority to decide who is loyal and who isn't.
That is a terrifying amount of power for a 22-year-old.
It is, and the sources show he dove right into it. There's a record of a list of 1,400 suspicious Germans living in the U.S.
A list he was managing.
Yes, and Hoover personally helped coordinate the arrest of 98 of them and designated over 1,000 more as arrestable. This was his training ground. This is where he learned that the Constitution has, well, loopholes, if you're scared enough.
And he rides that wave right into 1919 and the Red Scare.
Right. The war is over, but now the fear is communism. Anarchists, there are bombings.
A new enemy.
A new enemy, and Hoover gets promoted to head the Radical Division.
Again, with the names.
Again, look at the name, Radical Division. His job wasn't to investigate crimes that had happened. It was to monitor people for ideas that might lead to crimes.
Pre-crime, basically.
It's pre-crime. He starts building his index cards on people like Marcus Garvey, the black nationalist leader. He targets Emma Goldman, the famous anarchist.
And he went after Felix Frankfurter, the future Supreme Court justice.
Yes, Felix Frankfurter, who would later become a pillar of American law. Hoover called him the most dangerous man in the United States.
Why? What did Frankfurter do?
Because Frankfurter was sympathetic to the rights of aliens and radicals, he believed in due process. And to Hoover, that wasn't just a legal disagreement, it was subversive.
And all of this culminates in the Palmer raids.
The Palmer raids were Hoover's first masterpiece of logistics. Simultaneous raids in multiple cities, thousands of suspected leftists and anarchists arrested, many without warrants, thrown into overcrowded detention centers, deported.
It was a massive operation.
It was brutal. It was chaotic. But to Hoover, it was cleansing the nation. He was barely 25, and he was already reshaping the demographics of political dissent in America.
So he's the young prodigy. He's the guy who knows where the bodies are buried because he buried some of them.
That's a good way to put it.
And in 1924, the Bureau of Investigation, which was the precursor to the FBI, is a mess. It's corrupt. It's inefficient.
Totally. It was a political patronage mill.
So President Calvin Coolidge needs someone to clean it up. He taps Hoover.
He was 29 years old. Just imagine a 29-year-old being handed the keys to the Federal Investigative Service today. It's unthinkable.
And he doesn't just polish the furniture. He burns the house down and rebuilds it. The cleaning house phase of his career is wild to read about.
It is.
He fired people for the most superficial reasons.
It wasn't just about competence, it was about aesthetics. He wanted a specific look. He fired agents who, in his words, looked stupid like truck drivers.
He really said that.
That's a direct quote from the sources. He fired people he called pinheads.
What does a pinhead even look like in an FBI context? I have no idea.
Someone who didn't look like a lawyer or an accountant, I guess. He wanted men who wore suits, who had short hair, who polished their shoes. He wanted interchangeable parts in his machine.
And those parts had to be men.
Exclusively. This is a key detail. There were actually female agents in the Bureau before Hoover took over. Yes, he fired them all, every single one, and he banned the hiring of women for decades. He wanted a fraternity, a brotherhood of white, Protestant, conservative men who looked and thought exactly like he did.
So he purges the ranks, and then he brings in the technology. This is the scientific crime-fighting era.
Yeah.
And I think we take this for granted today because we watch CSI and Law and Order, but can you paint a picture of what policing was like before Hoover?
It was amateur hour, truly. If a crime happened, the local cop might pick up the murder weapon with his bare hands, stick it in his pocket, and walk it to the station.
No chain of custody, no evidence preservation.
Zero. There was no ballistics analysis. And if a criminal crossed state lines, say, he robbed a bank in Ohio and drove to Kentucky, the Ohio cops usually just gave up.
They just stopped at the border.
They had no jurisdiction, and there was no way to send a photo or fingerprints quickly to Kentucky to say, hey, watch out for this guy.
So Hoover sees this fragmentation as a problem of data management.
Exactly. He starts with fingerprints. Now, fingerprints have been around, but there was no central repository, no national database.
So he created one.
He established the identification division. He pushed, he cajoled, he pressured local police departments all over the country to send him their fingerprint cards.
And this goes back to the librarian thing. It's his ultimate library.
It is.
Wow.
By the mid-30s, he had millions of prints. But think about the logistics. You don't have a computer to scan them. You have a warehouse full of filing cabinets. You need an army of clerks, mostly women, actually, in the clerical roles, to visually match these whorls and loops.
It's an incredible undertaking.
He built the largest database of human identity the world had ever seen at that point.
And he didn't stop at prints. He built the lab.
The FBI laboratory in 1932, this is a game changer. The sources say he visited a Canadian scientist named Wilfred Jerome, who was doing pioneering work in forensics, and Hoover basically said, I want that.
I'll have one of those, please.
Pretty much. He brought in microscopes, chemical analysis, handwriting experts, ballistics. He turned the G-man from a door kicker into a scientist.
Which is great. That's the modernizer part of the legacy. That's the good stuff.
That is.
But then the 1930s explode. The Great Depression hits. And suddenly you have a new kind of criminal, the public enemy.
The celebrity gangster, John Dillinger, Babyface Nelson, Pretty Boy Floyd.
These guys weren't just criminals. They were folk heroes to some people.
They were. You have to remember, banks were foreclosing on people's farms and homes. So when John Dillinger robbed a bank, some people cheered.
They saw him as Robin Hood.
Exactly. And these guys had fast cars, V8 Fords, and Thompson submachine guns. They were outrunning and outgunning the local police forces.
This was a direct challenge to Hoover's order and his ego.
Oh, it was embarrassing. Hoover is sitting in D.C. with his card catalogs and his scientists, and these guys are running circles around his agents. He needed a win. Badly.
But his agents weren't ready for gunfights. They were lawyers and accountants.
That's the problem. And that leads to the disaster at Little Bohemia.
Oh, Little Bohemia. This is a classic story.
Little Bohemia, 1934. This should have been the FBI's shining moment. They tracked the entire Dillinger gang to a lodge in Wisconsin called Little Bohemia. They surrounded the place. They had the numbers. They had the element of surprise.
So what went wrong?
Everything. The agents started firing too early. They ended up shooting 3 local residents who were just walking out of the lodge after dinner.
Civilians.
Yes, civilians. They killed 1 and wounded 2. The gangsters inside heard the shots, slipped out the back windows, ran through the woods, and escaped.
So the FBI shoots the civilians and lets the bad guys get away.
It was a total humiliation. The press tore Hoover apart. They called his agents Keystone Cops. Hoover was furious. He realized that science wasn't enough. He needed killers, and he needed better PR.
Well, they eventually did get Dillinger.
They did.
Outside the Biograph Theater in Chicago, the lady in red tips them off and they ambush him.
Right. A huge victory for the Bureau. But here's a detail that shows you everything you need to know about Hoover's ego.
Go on.
The man who ran that operation on the ground was Melvin Purvis. He was the special agent in charge in Chicago. After Dillinger was killed, Purvis became a national hero.
Of course.
The press loved him. He was the man who got Dillinger.
And Hoover Did not like that.
Hoover destroyed him. He was insanely jealous. He couldn't stand sharing the spotlight. He started transferring Purvis to bad assignments, auditing his expenses, nitpicking his reports. He made his life a living hell.
Just out of pure spite.
Yes. He eventually drove Purvis out of the FBI completely because there could only be one face of the FBI, and it was going to be J. Edgar Hoover's face.
So after Dillinger, Hoover went on a branding offensive.
A massive one.
Huh.
He renamed the Federal Bureau of Investigation in 1935. He started consulting on Hollywood movies, like The FBI Story starring Jimmy Stewart.
He curated the image.
Absolutely. He became friends with Walter Winchell, the biggest gossip columnist in the country. He fed Winchell scoops, and Winchell wrote columns about how heroic J. Edgar Hoover was. He even oversaw the TV show The FBI.
He cultivated the myth. The G-man is incorruptible. The G-man always gets his man.
And that myth was a shield. As long as the public thought the FBI was perfect, nobody looked too closely at what was happening in the shadows.
But there was a massive hole in that myth.
Yeah.
A blind spot so big you could drive a truck full of bootleg whiskey through it. The Mafia.
This is the part that still baffles people. For decades, all through the 30s, 40s, and into the early 50s, Hoover insisted that the Mafia didn't exist.
He denied it publicly.
Publicly and privately, he called it a bugaboo. He said it was just loose associations of local gangs, not a national syndicate.
I have to stop you there. This defies logic. When he just talked about how he built the greatest intelligence network in history, he knew what kind of toothpaste radical professors were buying. How on earth does the world's greatest detective miss the fact that Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky are running a national crime board? That feels like incompetence.
It does, doesn't it? But the sources are pretty clear. It wasn't incompetence, it was a choice.
Okay, so why? What are the theories?
There are three main theories. The first one is about practicality, statistics.
He wanted easy wins.
Hoover lived and died by his budget hearings in Congress. He needed to show high conviction rates. Investigating the mob is incredibly hard. It's complex.
Right, it's not like catching a bank robber red-handed.
Exactly. You have shell companies, layers of insulation, witnesses who disappear. It takes years to build an RICO case, which didn't even exist as a concept yet. It was easier to arrest car thieves and bank robbers and show a 98% conviction rate to Congress.
Okay, that's the lazy bureaucrat theory. What's the second?
Fear of corruption. Hoover was obsessed with the purity of his agents. He knew they were human, they were underpaid. The starting salary was around $5,500 back then.
And the mob had unlimited cash.
Unlimited cash. Hoover was terrified that if he sent his squeaky clean accountants into the world of gambling and high-end vice, they would be corrupted. And a scandal involving bribed agents would destroy the incorruptible brand he'd worked so hard to build.
So he ignores the crime to protect the image of the police. I can see the logic, even if it's twisted.
It is twisted. But then there's the third, darker theory, the blackmail theory.
This is the one that won't go away.
No, it won't. The rumor, and I stress, the sources present this as a persistent rumor, not a proven fact, is that the syndicate had leverage on Hoover. Specifically, mobsters like Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello supposedly held compromising photos of Hoover.
Photos of him with his deputy, Clyde Tolson.
Right, photos implying a homosexual relationship. Now, we don't have the photos. They've never surfaced.
But the threat was enough.
But think about it from a leverage perspective. Hoover's entire power base rested on his moral authority. He was the avenging angel of American morality. If proof came out that he was gay in the 1940s or 50s, he would have been destroyed in 5 minutes.
So the theory is, you leave us alone, and these photos stay in the safe.
It fits the facts. The mob operated with near-total impunity for 20 years while Hoover was busy chasing communists. It wasn't until 1957 that the bubble burst.
The Appalachian meeting.
You can't make this stuff up. Over 60 mob bosses from all over the country, from New York, Chicago, Florida, gather at a rural estate in Appalachian, New York for a summit.
And the FBI didn't know about it.
The FBI had no idea. A local state trooper, not the FBI, a local trooper gets suspicious about all the limousines with out-of-state plates driving up to this one house. He raids the place.
And it's chaos.
It's a complete farce. You have these overweight mob bosses in silk suits running through the woods, jumping into streams, trying to escape. They arrest dozens of them. The newspapers the next day have headlines like, "Mob Summit Raided." Hoover could no longer deny it. He looked like an absolute fool.
So he shamed into action.
Reluctantly, he created the Top Hoodlum program. But even then, you get the sense his heart wasn't in it. He hated the mob, sure, but he didn't fear them the way he feared subversives.
And that brings us to the pivot. The moment where the lawman fully transforms into the spy chief. We have to talk about the Shadow War. COINTELPRO.
This is the darkest chapter in the FBI's history, without a doubt. By the mid-50s, Hoover is frustrated. He's winning battles, but he feels like he's losing the war for America's soul. The Supreme Court is starting to rule in favor of defendants' rights. He feels handcuffed by the law.
So he decides to operate outside the law.
Completely. In 1956, he launches COINTELPRO counterintelligence program.
And the goal wasn't just to spy, right? This wasn't just about gathering information.
No. The explicit goal was to disrupt, misdirect, discredit, and neutralize. Those are his words. From the memos. They weren't just watching targets, they were actively trying to destroy them from the inside.
Give us the menu of dirty tricks. What are we talking about here?
I mean, everything. Illegal wiretaps, obviously,
Wow.
but also sending forged letters to a target's wife accusing him of adultery to break up their marriage. Forging documents to make rival groups think the other was planning an attack, hoping to incite violence between them. Using the IRS to audit people. Planting false stories in the press.
And who was the target?
Officially, the Communist Party USA. But Hoover's definition of subversive was incredibly elastic.
It was anyone he didn't like.
Pretty much. It stretched to include the anti-war movement, the New Left, celebrities like Charlie Chaplin and John Lennon, and most obsessively, the civil rights movement.
We have to drill down on Martin Luther King Jr. here. Because the level of obsession Hoover had with King, it wasn't just professional, it felt personal, it felt hateful.
It was a deep, visceral hatred. Hoover viewed King as a messy, disruptive force. He called him the most notorious liar in the country. But it went so much deeper than name-calling.
Oh, bugs.
The FBI bugged King's hotel rooms. They followed him everywhere. They recorded his extramarital affairs.
And they tried to weaponize that information.
Constantly. Hoover would invite journalists to his office and play the tapes for them off the record, trying to get them to write hit pieces. He played the tapes for President Kennedy and his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, to try and poison them against King.
But then it culminates in the infamous suicide letter. And I think we need to actually talk about what was in this, because people need to understand how unhinged this was.
It's truly chilling.
This was a package sent to King's home, right? Not to his office.
To his home, addressed to him. It contained a compilation of the audio recordings, the so-called sex tapes, and an unsigned anonymous letter written by FBI agents.
And what did it say?
It pretended to be from a disillusioned black follower. It calls King an evil, abnormal beast and a colossal fraud. And then the final paragraph says this: King, there's only one thing left for you to do. You know what it is. You have just 34 days in which to do it before your filthy, abnormal, fraudulent self is bared to the nation.
There's only one thing left for you to do.
King and his advisors, including Coretta Scott King, interpreted that immediately as an instruction to commit suicide.
Of course.
They wanted him to kill himself before he went to Oslo to accept the Nobel Peace Prize.
Just pause on that for a second. The federal law enforcement agency of the United States tried to psychologically torture a civil rights leader into suicide.
It's monstrous, and it wasn't an isolated incident of this kind of cruelty. Look at the case of Viola Liuzzo.
This story just breaks my heart every time I read about it. Tell us about her.
Viola Liuzzo was a white mother of 5 from Detroit, a housewife. She saw the violence in Selma on TV during the voting rights march, and she felt called to go help.
She just drove down there on her own.
Drove down to Alabama to ferry marchers back and forth between Selma and Montgomery. In March of 1965, she was driving a car with a young black passenger when the KKK chased her down and shot her in the head, killing her instantly.
She was a martyr. She was murdered for doing the right thing. A true hero.
She was, and Hoover's reaction? He didn't honor her. He was worried that her death would generate too much sympathy for the Civil Rights Act that was being debated.
So what did he do?
The very next day, he started personally spreading vicious rumors to President Johnson and to the press. He told them she was a heroin addict. He told them she had puncture marks on her arms, which was a lie. The marks were from the glass of the shattered car window. He told them she was having sexual relationships with black men and had abandoned her family.
My God, why? Why smear a dead woman?
To protect the narrative, and frankly, to protect the Bureau. Because it turned out that one of the 4 Klansmen in the car that shot her was an FBI informant.
Oh my God.
His name was Gary Thomas Rowe. He was on the FBI payroll. Hoover was terrified that if the case was investigated too closely, it would come out that his informant was an accomplice to murder.
So he destroyed the victim's reputation to hide his own liability.
That's exactly what he did. It's a pattern. The same thing happens with the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in Birmingham.
In 1963.
Oh.
4 little girls killed.
Same thing. The FBI actually identified the 4 KKK suspects quickly. They knew who did it within a couple of years. But Hoover blocked the prosecution.
He blocked it. Why?
He told his agents not to share their files with the local prosecutors. His official reason was that he claimed an all-white Alabama jury wouldn't convict, so why bother?
But what was the real reason?
The sources suggest he didn't want to expose his KKK informants, and he had a personal feud with the lawyers at the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. He didn't want to cooperate with them, so he sealed the files. Those men walked free for decades. Justice was delayed until long after Hoover was dead.
It seems like for Hoover, the integrity of his files and his agency was more important than the lives of the people those files were supposed to protect.
That is the perfect way to put it. The files became the end goal in themselves.
Which brings us to the question of survival. How does a man who is doing this, smearing victims, ignoring the mob, spying on citizens, keep his job for 48 years, especially when presidents like Truman and JFK actively disliked him?
It comes back to the files. But not just the criminal files, the official and confidential files. The dirt.
The blackmail material.
Hoover collected embarrassing information on everyone who mattered in Washington. Congressmen, senators, judges, journalists, and especially presidents.
Give us an example. How did he use this against a president?
Well, take JFK. Hoover knew all about Kennedy's affair with a woman named Judith Exner. The problem was, Judith Exner was also sleeping with Sam Giancana, the mob boss of Chicago.
That is a national security nightmare. The President of the United States sharing a mistress with a top mob boss.
Exactly. Hoover went to the White House for a private lunch with Kennedy. He didn't threaten him explicitly. The sources say he just laid it out on the table. Mr. President, we have information about this woman. The subtext was crystal clear.
I know what you're doing.
I know what you're doing. As long as I'm director, this stays secret. If I'm fired, who knows what might leak?
It's the ultimate job insurance.
President Johnson understood this perfectly. There's a famous quote, and pardon the language, but it's pure LBJ, where people asked why he didn't fire Hoover. Johnson said, "It's better to have him inside the tent pissing out than outside the tent pissing in."
That is colorful and probably very accurate. Johnson even waived the mandatory retirement age for him.
He did. Hoover was supposed to retire at 70. Johnson signed an executive order letting him stay on indefinitely. He essentially made him director for life.
Nixon was afraid of him, too. There are tapes of Nixon saying he couldn't fire him.
Yes, the Watergate tapes. Nixon says he won't fire Hoover because he's afraid Hoover would pull down the temple with him, meaning release all the dirt he had on Nixon.
So Hoover also kept things from the presidents. The Venona Project is the big one here.
This is a massive story of institutional arrogance. In the 40s and 50s, U.S. and British intelligence cracked the Soviet diplomatic codes. They were reading Moscow's mail.
So they knew who the spies were.
Yeah. They identified atomic spies like Klaus Fuchs, spies in the State Department. It was the smoking gun of the Cold War, proving the extent of Soviet infiltration.
And Hoover sat on it.
He kept the intercepts in his personal office safe. He didn't tell President Truman. He didn't tell the Attorney General. He didn't want the military or the newly formed CIA getting credit or getting involved. He wanted the FBI to have the monopoly on spy hunting.
So he let the President of the United States operate in the dark about a massive national security threat just to protect his turf.
That's right. It's an incredible betrayal of his duty.
And what about this plan for mass detention?
The master warrant. In 1950, at the height of the Korean War scare, he sent a plan to the White House proposing that, in the event of a national emergency, he be allowed to suspend habeas corpus and immediately detain 12,000 Americans who were on his subversives list.
Massed jailing without trial.
That is literally a police state.
What did Truman do?
Truman, to his credit, just ignored it. But the fact that Hoover wrote it, planned it, and had the list of names ready to go, it shows you that he didn't really believe in democracy when things got tough. He believed in control.
Okay, we've spent a lot of time on the public monster, but I want to pivot now to the private enigma. Because for a man who knew everyone else's secrets, he was a black hole when it came to his own.
He was. He built a fortress around his private life. But there was one person inside that fortress, Clyde Tolson.
Clyde Tolson, the associate director of the FBI. But he was so much more than a deputy, wasn't he?
He was Hoover's shadow, his alter ego, as Hoover called him. They were inseparable. They rode to work together in the morning in Hoover's armored limousine. They ate lunch together at the same table at the Mayflower Hotel every single day.
Every day.
They went to nightclubs in New York together. They went on vacation to the racetrack in Del Mar, California, together every summer for weeks.
And neither of them ever married or was publicly linked with a woman?
Correct. Two lifelong bachelors in what was essentially a Boston marriage. When Hoover died, he left his entire estate, his house, everything, to Tolson.
And at the funeral?
At the funeral, it was Clyde Tolson who was handed the folded American flag from Hoover's casket. That's the role traditionally reserved for a spouse or next of kin.
So we have to ask the question that everyone asks, were they gay?
It's the central question about his private life, and the answer is complex. If you define gay as having a sexual relationship with a man, we don't know for sure. There's no sex tape. There's no definitive proof.
Right.
But if you define it as sharing your emotional life, your intimacy, and your devotion with a member of the same sex, then yes, absolutely. It was the primary relationship of both of their lives.
But this brings up the incredible tragic psychology of the closet. We are talking about the 1940s and 50s.
Exactly. Being gay wasn't just frowned upon, it was illegal. It was classified as a mental illness. And Hoover was the top cop in the country enforcing those laws. He ran the so-called sex deviant programs, purging gay people from government jobs.
That's the tragedy, isn't it?
Yeah.
The Roy Cohn connection comes to mind. Another powerful, closeted man.
Right. Roy Cohn worked with Hoover during the McCarthy hearings. They both aggressively hunted deviance and security risks, which was often code for gay people, while living these secret lives themselves. It's a form of internalized self-hatred projected outward. If I punish them, it proves I'm not one of them.
What about the cross-dressing rumors? Everyone knows the story about Hoover wearing a dress and a feather boa.
Ah, yes. The story comes from a single source. A woman named Susan Rosenstyle, who was the ex-wife of a mob associate. She claimed she saw Hoover in drag at a party at the Plaza Hotel in 1958, introduced to her as Mary.
Is it true?
Most serious biographers, even the ones who are convinced he was gay, say probably not. The source was unreliable, she had a vendetta against Hoover, and the story's just a little too perfect, you know?
Right, it's almost a caricature.
It feels like a piece of gossip that stuck because it's the ultimate irony, the macho G-man in a dress. But honestly, the reality of his decades-long devoted partnership with Tolson is far more interesting and human than the cross-dressing myth.
He did have other soft spots, though. The dogs.
Oh, the dogs. He was obsessed with his Cairn Terriers. He treated them like his children. He would give puppies as gifts to presidents. When his dogs died, he had them buried in a special pet cemetery and wept.
It's such a strange contrast.
It is. You have a man who could destroy a civil rights leader without blinking, but would be brought to tears over a sick terrier.
And the gambling. The great moral crusader loved the ponies.
He was an inveterate horse player, as the sources put it. He didn't just bet a few bucks. He was obsessed. He would send his FBI agents to the track to place $100 bets for him.
$100 back then was a lot of money.
It's like $1,000 today. And he was using government employees as his personal bookies.
Wait, isn't that illegal? Or at least incredibly sketchy for the head of the FBI.
Totally sketchy. And he would go to the track and hang out with wealthy oilmen and sometimes people with connections to organized crime. Again, the rules applied to you, not to him.
So we arrive at the end, May 2nd, 1972. Hoover is 77 years old. He's still the director. He has outlasted everyone.
And he dies in his sleep of a heart attack in his D.C. home.
The reaction must have been complicated. A mix of grief and maybe relief.
Publicly. It was pure mourning. He was the first civil servant to lie in state in the Capitol Rotunda. That honor is usually reserved for presidents and generals. Nixon gave a eulogy calling him a giant. The public myth was still very much intact.
But privately, in the halls of power.
Privately, there was a massive sigh of relief in Washington. Nixon immediately appointed L. Patrick Gray, a political loyalist with zero FBI experience, to replace him. Nixon wanted to get control of the files.
The blackmail files.
Yes. But Hoover's loyal secretary, Helen Gandy, outsmarted him. She spent weeks after his death shredding his official and confidential files. We will never know exactly what was in them. She destroyed the leverage before Nixon could get his hands on it.
But then the dam breaks. The Church Committee in the mid-1970s.
That was the reckoning. After Watergate, Congress finally said, we need to look under the hood of our intelligence agencies. The Church Committee exposed COINTELPRO, They exposed the MLK tapes. They exposed the illegal wiretaps and the mail opening programs.
And the statue crumbled.
Seemingly overnight, Hoover went from American hero to American villain in the public consciousness.
And yet, his name is still on the building. The FBI headquarters on Pennsylvania Avenue is the J. Edgar Hoover building.
It's a massive, brutalist, concrete fortress, which fits his personality perfectly. But yes, it's incredibly controversial. Senator Harry Reid once called his name a stain on the building.
Have there been efforts to change it?
Oh, yes. There have been bills introduced by both Democrats and Republicans over the years to strip his name from the building, but they've never succeeded.
Why not?
Inertia, bureaucracy, and maybe a little bit of a sense that, well, it's a reminder. If you take his name off, you might forget what the agency is capable of, for better and for worse.
There's one last layer I want to touch on before we wrap up. An expert analysis we came across about Hoover and Christian nationalism.
Right, from the book The Gospel of J. Edgar Hoover by Lerone Martin.
What's the argument there?
It's a brilliant modern take. The argument is that Hoover didn't just build a police force. He built a kind of religious order. He intentionally cultivated an image of the FBI as a moral crusade.
How so?
He favored agents who were religious, particularly from conservative, Protestant, or Catholic backgrounds. He framed the battle against communism not just as a political fight, but as a spiritual war between Christianity and godless atheism.
So the FBI was a crusade.
Exactly. He courted evangelicals like Billy Graham. He wrote for religious magazines. He normalized the idea that to be a good American meant being a white conservative Christian. And if you dissented, if you were a leftist or civil rights agitator or an anti-war protester, you weren't just politically wrong, you were ungodly, a sinner.
That fusion of faith and national security is a legacy that is still very much alive today.
Very much so.
That is a heavy thought. So, looking back at the whole picture, the librarian, the G-man, the shadow, what is the final takeaway? What's the legacy?
I think the tragedy of J. Edgar Hoover is that he mistook the state for the law, and then he eventually mistook himself for the state.
L'État, c'est moi. I am the state.
Precisely. He built a machine to protect America, but eventually the machine just existed to protect him and his vision of America. And it teaches us a profound lesson about the danger of unaccountable power.
We have term limits for presidents for a reason.
And after Hoover, Congress passed a law limiting the FBI director to a single 10-year term. It was a direct response to his 48-year reign. We learned that you cannot let one person hold all the nation's secrets for half a century.
It's a lesson we seem to have to keep relearning, though.
Indeed.
This has been a massive deep dive, but I feel like we only scratched the surface of the files. Here's a final thought for you, the listener. We live in the age of big data. J. Edgar Hoover had index cards and filing cabinets.
A physical system.
Today, the NSA and the FBI have servers that can hold the entire internet. The tools of surveillance and data collection are infinitely more powerful than anything Hoover ever dreamed of.
The capability is there, and it's orders of magnitude greater.
So the question is, in our quest for safety, for protection from terrorists or criminals or foreign influence, how much power do we hand over to the people in the shadows? And without a single, visible Hoover-like figure to focus on, do we even know who is holding the keys anymore?
That is the question that keeps me up at night.
Thanks for listening. Go check out the show notes for the book recommendations and the text of that letter to MLK. It's worth seeing with your own eyes. We'll see you in the next deep dive.
Stay curious and watch your files.
Welcome to the debate. Today we are opening the file on a figure who casts a longer shadow over the American century than perhaps any president he served. We are talking, of course, about J. Edgar Hoover. He wasn't just a man, he was an institution. For 48 years, under 8 different presidents, from Coolidge all the way to Nixon, he was the immutable face of law enforcement in the United States.
And that is a tenure that is, frankly, terrifying to consider in retrospect. Imagine one unelected official holding the keys to the kingdom from the Roaring '20s to the Watergate scandal. It's unprecedented in a democracy. And honestly, looking at the source material, it's a tenure that curdled. We're looking at a man who built a modern machine of justice, yes, but who also turned that machine into a weapon of personal paranoia and political repression.
And that really is the paradox we have to wrestle with today. The central question is inescapable. Was J. Edgar Hoover the necessary visionary, the architect of justice who dragged American policing out of the dark ages, or was he, as you suggest, a tyrant of the Bureau who used the badge to violate the very liberties he swore to protect? I'm taking the position that Hoover was a brilliant if flawed administrator who brought science, discipline, and stability to a chaotic nation.
And I'm looking at the cost of that stability. I believe the evidence shows that Hoover's legacy is defined by a systemic abuse of power. We're talking about blackmail, the destruction of reputations, and a war on dissent that left a permanent stain on our democracy.
I understand the gravity of those charges, but to be fair to the man, we cannot judge him solely through the lens of today. We have to look at what he walked into. Let's just rewind to 1924. The Bureau of Investigation. It wasn't even called the FBI yet. It was a joke. It was a disaster. It was corrupt, it was inefficient, and it was a dumping ground for political hacks who needed a government salary.
It was a mess, I'll grant you that. The Teapot Dome scandal had just happened. The Department of Justice was in shambles.
Exactly. Mess is putting it lightly. When Hoover took over at just 29 years old, which is mind-boggling in itself, he didn't just rearrange the furniture, he burned the house down. He fired the agents he famously described as looking like truck drivers and pinheads. He didn't want thugs, he wanted professionals. He demanded lawyers and accountants. He wanted men who could build a case, not just crack a skull. He instituted inspections, dress codes, rigid conduct rules.
He certainly wanted men he could mold. That requirement for lawyers and accountants, that wasn't just about professionalism. It was about creating a specific type of agent. Middle class, white, conservative, and, obedient. He was building a clone army.
It was about quality control and modernization. Look at the science. He visited Wilfred Jerome's laboratory in Canada in 1929, and again in 1932. He saw the future of forensics there, ballistics, toxicology. He brought that rigor back to the U.S., establishing the FBI laboratory. He created the centralized fingerprint file, which became the largest collection in human history. Before Hoover, law enforcement was a guessing game. He turned it into a science. He turned a group of amateur sleuths into the G-men. He made the badge mean something. At its height, it was statistically harder to become an FBI agent than to get into Harvard.
That is a compelling narrative for his administrative genius, and I don't deny he was a bureaucrat par excellence. He knew how to file paperwork. But we have to look behind the curtain. You call it quality control, but I call it the construction of a personal fiefdom. That G-Man brand was a shield. While he was firing the truck drivers, he was simultaneously establishing the FBI-indexed, a massive secret blacklist. He wasn't just compiling files on bank robbers, he was compiling files on anyone he deemed a threat to his specific, rigid worldview.
But every nation needs intelligence to function, especially in the turbulent 20th century. You have to know who is who.
But this wasn't just intelligence. It was leverage. It was job security through extortion. The source material is explicit on this. We have President Richard Nixon, a man who knew a thing or two about dirty tricks, caught on tape in 1971 saying he couldn't fire Hoover because he was afraid of Hoover's reprisals. Truman felt it. JFK felt it. They all knew that Hoover had the dirt. The political cost was too high because Hoover knew where the skeletons were buried, often literally. He prioritized his own power over public accountability. He was chasing political ghosts while real, dangerous threats were ignored because they didn't fit his narrative.
I think we need to be careful about conflating his survival instincts with his operational success. You mentioned chasing ghosts, but let's look at the 1930s. The threats were very corporeal. We were talking about the era of the public enemy. This was the time when gangs were outgunning local police. You had guys like John Dillinger, Babyface Nelson, Machine Gun Kelly, crossing state lines, robbing banks, and the local sheriffs were powerless to stop them because their jurisdiction ended at the county line. Hoover saw that the country needed a federal response.
And he certainly made sure everyone knew about that federal response.
Because he had to. The public was terrified. He built the narrative that the federal government could win. Under his leadership, the Bureau tracked down Dillinger. They caught Kelly. They captured Alvin Karpis. He restored faith in the rule of law during the Great Depression. That wasn't smoke and mirrors. Those were real arrests of violent men.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that narrative as fully honest. The G-Man legend was heavily manufactured. Hoover was obsessed with the media. He didn't just catch criminals, he consulted on Warner Brothers movies like The FBI Story. He was curating his own mythology in real time. But look at the operational reality. Take the raid at Little Bohemia in Wisconsin in 1934.
That was a difficult operation. Conditions were poor.
It was a fiasco. It was a disaster. You had agents firing blindly into the night. An agent was killed, a civilian bystander was killed, and the gangsters, the actual targets, escaped out the back window. It showed that these lawyers and accountants Hoover hired might have been good at filing paperwork, but they were woefully unprepared for a gunfight, and Hoover stayed in Washington the whole time.
Law enforcement is dangerous. Early operations often go wrong. They learn from it. They improve their tactics.
But when operations went right, Hoover couldn't handle sharing the spotlight. Look at Melvin Purvis. Purvis was the actual G-Man. He was the agent in the field who led the operations against Dillinger and Pretty Boy Floyd. The public loved him. He was a hero. The press couldn't get enough of him. And what did Hoover do? Did he promote him? No. He maneuvered Purvis out of the bureau because he was jealous of the publicity. He scrutinized his expense reports. He sidelined him. Hoover created a cult of personality where he was the only hero allowed on the stage.
I would frame it differently. Hoover understood that for the Bureau to survive and get funding from a stingy Congress, it needed a unified face. It needed to be seen as a monolithic force of order. If you have individual star agents, the institution looks weak or fractured. And regarding the gangsters, well, the results speak for themselves. The wave of bank robberies and kidnappings that plagued the Midwest did end. That required a centralized, strong federal hand, which Hoover provided.
If he was so concerned with organized crime, then we have to address the elephant in the room, or rather the La Cosa Nostra in the room. This is one of the most damning aspects of his career. For decades, Hoover denied the existence of the Mafia. He insisted there was no national crime syndicate. While he was busy chasing communists and reading philosophical treatises, the Mafia was running drugs, prostitution, and unions across the entire country.
It is a significant gap in the record, I admit. The focus was elsewhere.
It's more than a gap. It's a blind spot the size of the Atlantic Ocean. He flatly denied the Mafia existed until the Appalachian meeting in 1957. And let's be clear, the FBI didn't find that meeting. State troopers in upstate New York stumbled upon a summit of mob bosses because they noticed too many fancy cars in a rural town. That made it impossible for Hoover to ignore. That is a massive failure of federal law enforcement.
That is a fair critique, but we have to look at the why. Why would a man obsessed with order ignore the mob? There are sensational theories, of course, that get a lot of airtime.
They aren't just sensational, they are plausible. There are persistent reports that mobsters Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello held compromising photos of Hoover with his deputy and constant companion, Clyde Tolson, or the theory that Costello was feeding Hoover horse-facing tips. We know Hoover was an inveterate horse player. He loved the track. If the top cop is compromised by the criminals, it explains the blindness perfectly.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, because most serious biographers dismiss the blackmail theory as unlikely. It makes for a good movie, but the administrative explanation is much more consistent with Hoover's character, and frankly, more interesting. Investigating the Mafia was messy. It required undercover work, it required bribing informants, and crucially, Hoover feared it would corrupt his agents.
You mean the accountants?
Exactly. In the mid-50s, agents were making about $5,500 a year. Hoover didn't want his clean-cut, suit-wearing agents hanging around mobsters who were flashing rolls of cash worth triple their salary. He was terrified of a scandal where an FBI agent was bought. He wanted to protect the Bureau's reputation for incorruptibility, so he chose not to engage. It was a risk-averse calculation to protect the institution's image, not a submission to blackmail. He prioritized the purity of the Bureau over the safety of the streets.
Risk-averse is a very generous way to describe allowing a national crime syndicate to operate unchecked for 30 years. But let's pivot to where he was decidedly not risk-averse. Civil rights and political dissent. This is where the architect of justice moniker completely falls apart for me.
I see where you are going, but we must contextualize Hoover within the Cold War. You can't understand Hoover in the 1960s without understanding the fear of the 1950s. He wasn't operating in a vacuum. He was tasked by presidents, starting with FDR and moving through Eisenhower and Kennedy, to investigate subversion. Take the Venona Project, for instance.
Which he kept secret even from President Truman.
Because it was highly sensitive. Venona was the decryption of Soviet cables. It proved definitively that there was Soviet espionage happening in the U.S. government. They were real saboteurs. We had German U-boat landings in Florida and Long Island during the war. Hoover viewed his role as protecting the American way of life. He genuinely believed that the fabric of society was under attack by foreign ideologies.
And what was that American way of life? Recent scholarship suggests it was rooted deeply in white Christian nationalism. His protection was weaponized against Black Americans. The FBI's obsession with Martin Luther King Jr. wasn't about Soviet spies. It was about destroying a powerful Black leader who challenged the status quo.
He did fear communist influence within King's circle.
That was the pretext, not the reality. Look at the suicide letter. The FBI sent King an anonymous letter shortly before he was set to accept the Nobel Peace Prize. It contained audio recordings of his extramarital affairs obtained via illegal bugs in his hotel rooms and suggested there was only one thing left for you to do before the details were released. That isn't counterintelligence. That is psychological warfare against a private citizen. That is the federal government trying to drive a man to kill himself.
The surveillance of King is certainly the darkest chapter. I won't defend the methods. They were aberrant. However, we have to remember that Hoover was convinced, partly due to the presence of advisors around King like Stanley Levison, who had actual communist ties, that the civil rights movement was being used as a Trojan horse for subversion. I'm not saying he was right, history shows he was wrong, but his motivation was consistent with his mandate to stop radicalization.
That is a distinction without a difference to the victims. Look at the case of Viola Luso. This story makes my blood boil. She was a white civil rights worker, a mother from Detroit, murdered by the Klan in Alabama in 1965 following the Selma to Montgomery marches. She was driving a car, helping people.
A tragedy.
It was more than a tragedy, it was a cover-up. One of the Klansmen in the car that shot her was an FBI informant, Gary Thomas Rowe. To cover up the Bureau's proximity to the crime, to hide the fact that they were paying a man who participated in a murder, Hoover went on the offensive. He personally spread rumors to President Johnson that Luso was a drug addict and had abandoned her children to have sex with Black men.
That is difficult to reconcile with the image of the law and order man.
It's not difficult, it's vile. That isn't stopping subversion, that is a vicious smear campaign against a murder victim to protect the Bureau's PR. It shows a man who had completely lost his moral compass.
I acknowledge that the Luso incident is indefensible. Hoover had a tendency to double down when the Bureau was threatened. But we also have to look at the other side of the coin in the South. The FBI did identify suspects in the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing. They were on the ground.
And then Hoover sealed the files. He blocked prosecution. He wrote a memo saying the chances of conviction were remote and told agents not to share results with prosecutors. He sat on evidence of the murder of 4 little girls to protect his sources. That isn't law enforcement. That is obstruction of justice.
It's complicated, though. There was deep systemic mistrust between federal and local investigators in Alabama. Hoover often didn't trust local juries to convict white supremacists, which, let's be honest, was a valid concern in the 1960s South. He didn't want the FBI to be embarrassed by an acquittal. Again, it's that obsession with the Bureau's reputation. But I want to zoom out to the broader program you alluded to earlier, COINTELPRO.
COINTELPRO is the smoking gun. It stands for a counterintelligence program. From 1956 to 1971, this was a formalized dirty tricks program We are not talking about surveillance. We are talking about active disruption, burglary, black bag jobs they called them, forged documents, inciting violence between rival groups, literally trying to get the Black Panthers to go to war with other nationalist groups. Hoover targeted everyone, the Communist Party, the Black Panthers, even John Lennon and Charlie Chaplin.
It was expansive, yes.
It was illegal. In 1950, even submitted a plan to Truman to suspend habeas corpus and detain 12,000 Americans in camps if a national emergency occurred. Truman ignored it, thank God, but the intent was there. He wanted the power to lock up anyone he disagreed with.
Truman ignored that plan, which shows the system of checks and balances did exist, even if barely. But regarding COINTELPRO, while the methods are condemned now, we have to acknowledge that Hoover often operated with qualified permission from the highest levels. FDR authorized wiretapping of suspected subversives way back in the 40s. Hoover wasn't a rogue agent, he was the tool of the presidency. Presidents liked having Hoover do the dirty work so they could keep their hands clean.
He was a tool who sharpened himself.
And he was effective. Look at the Communist Party USA. By 1957, due to FBI infiltration, it's estimated that 1,500 of its 10,000 members were actually FBI informants. He effectively neutralized the organization. He believed he was the bulwark against revolution, and in his mind, he succeeded. There was no communist revolution in the United States.
He neutralized dissent, not just revolution. He equated political disagreement with treason. When you have a secret police force that infiltrates legal political parties, destroys marriages, and tries to drive people to suicide, you don't have a democracy anymore. You have a police state. The Church Committee in the 70s, after Hoover died, declared these activities illegal and unconstitutional. That is the verdict of history.
And yet, the building is still named after him, the J. Edgar Hoover Building on Pennsylvania Avenue.
For now, though Senator Harry Reid and others have tried to strip his name from it, calling it a stain. It's ironic that the headquarters of justice is named after a man who so often circumvented it.
But the fact that the FBI exists as a potent, scientific, professional organization is his doing. That is the paradox. You cannot have the modern FBI without Hoover. He built the structure that eventually investigated Watergate. He built the academy. He instilled the discipline. He took a corrupt backwater agency and turned it into the premier law enforcement agency in the world. Even his critics used the tools he built.
But at a cost that we are still paying for. He left a legacy that says security justifies any violation of liberty. He taught the state how to spy on its citizens. Every time we debate NSA surveillance or data privacy, we are debating in the shadow of J. Edgar Hoover.
That brings us to our closing thoughts. Hoover is... He's a complicated figure who built a necessary institution from nothing. He instituted professionalism and scientific rigor that defines modern policing. While his methods were sometimes authoritarian, they were often a product of his time and the demands of 8 different presidents who relied on him. He was a man of his era, an era of world wars and cold wars who believed that order was the prerequisite for liberty.
But technical competence does not excuse moral bankruptcy. Hoover's legacy is a warning about the dangers of unchecked power within a democracy. He confused the security of the nation with the security of his own job and his own prejudices. He left a stain on the FBI building that bears his name. He showed us that when we trade civil liberties for the illusion of safety, we often end up with neither.
Or to investigate and the citizen's right to dissent. We grapple with this every time we talk about digital surveillance or national security.
And perhaps the most fascinating aspect is the personal contradiction. The man who hunted deviants and enforced rigid social norms lived a life of intense secrecy. He shared his life with Clyde Tolson, his associate director. They dined together every night, vacationed together, and are ultimately buried yards apart. The man who policed American morality lived a life that, by his own strict standards, would have been on a list.
Indeed, whether viewed as an architect of justice or a tyrant, J. Edgar Hoover's impact on the American century is undeniable. The best ideas of security must always be challenged by the rigors of civil liberty.
And that is a debate that will never truly end.
Thank you for listening to The Debate.
Until next time.
Welcome to The Critique. Today we're looking at a biographical article on J. Edgar Hoover.
A big one.
A huge one. It covers the full 48 years, the forensics, the modernization, and of course the dark side with COINTELPRO.
It's all in there.
It is, and the draft is packed with information, but the narrative arc is just struggling to hold it all together.
Right.
We need to fix the structure to make the big themes really land. So let's start with what feels like the most glaring issue. The placement of the private life section.
Yeah, that was the first thing I noticed. The author has pushed the whole discussion of Hoover's relationship with Clyde Tolson and the rumors about his sexuality all the way to the very end.
Right.
It's treated like this tabloid addendum, a kind of fun fact footer.
Well, that is a pretty standard convention for biographies, though, isn't it? You do the career, then you do the personal life. Why doesn't that work here?
Because with Hoover, you just can't separate the two without completely breaking the logic of the history. I mean, if you leave the sexuality discussion until the end, the whole section on organized crime back in the 30s and 40s makes no sense.
How so?
Well, the text says Hoover persistently denied the mafia even existed for decades, right? He focused on bank robbers instead. It gives his official excuse that he didn't want to corrupt his agents. But without the context of his private life, that just reads like incompetence.
So the reader's left thinking he was just bad at his job rather than compromised.
Exactly. Well, not just compromised, but maybe even held hostage. And the submission actually has the smoking gun, it's just buried in the wrong place.
Okay.
In the American Mafia section, there's a sentence mentioning that Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello supposedly had compromising photos of Hoover and Tolson.
Right.
Then, like 10 pages later, in the private life section, we finally get the Anthony Summers claim that blackmail made him reluctant to pursue the mob.
Okay, yeah, I see the disconnect. You have the effect in Chapter 3 and the cause in Chapter 10.
The fix is to move those bricks. The author needs to take that private life material, specifically the inseparable nature of his life with Tolson, the vacations, the rumors of those photos, and weave them directly into the organized crime narrative.
That really changes the genre of that section, though.
It does. It turns a bureaucratic history into a thriller. I mean, imagine reading about his refusal to go after the mob, and then in the very next paragraph you learn that the mob boss might have photos of the director engaged in what was then illegal activity.
Suddenly his denial of the mafia isn't a policy error.
It's a survival tactic. It creates tension. The reader understands why he's lying. And this actually points to a broader structural problem with the draft.
Which is?
It's too compartmentalized. There's a section for politics, one for crime, one for legacy. But Hoover's career was driven by an ideology that spanned all of those things.
And you're talking about the white Christian nationalism angle that's mentioned?
Yes, this is the second major critique. The author introduces this idea citing Lerone Martin's book right at the very end, in the legacy section. It's presented as a retrospective label. You know, looking back, scholars now say he was a Christian nationalist.
And you think that label needs to be applied much earlier?
It needs to be the engine, not the exhaust pipe. If you wait until the end to explain his worldview, the civil rights section in the 1960s feels completely disjointed.
Okay.
The text list has attacks on Martin Luther King Jr., the Black Panthers, the Nation of Islam, and it just feels like a series of aggressive police actions. We see the what, but we don't feel the why.
The text does mention he thought they were threats to national security. Isn't that enough of a why?
I really don't think it is, no. Not for the level of vitriol he showed. The text mentions that infamous letter sent to King Fulitz, the one suggesting he commit suicide.
Horrifying.
That is not national security work. That's a moral judgment. It's a crusade. And the author needs to pull that Christian nationalism thread all the way back to the early life section.
The early life section does mention his membership in the Kappa Alpha Order.
It does. And it notes they revered Robert E. Lee as a spiritual founder. It also notes his high school debates against abolishing the death penalty. Those aren't just trivia.
They're the seeds of the ideology.
Exactly. The author needs to explicitly connect those early days to the later abuses. When he attacks the Black Panthers, the text should reference his view of the FBI as a religious order. It completely reframes his actions.
So how would you write that transition specifically?
When discussing COINTELPRO against Black nationalist groups, I'd put in a paragraph explaining that Hoover didn't just see them as political radicals.
He saw them as a fundamental threat to the Christian order of America. He wasn't just a cop, he was a Grand Inquisitor.
That definitely darkens the tone, but it feels more honest. It moves from a list of bad things he did to a character study of a fanatic.
And to be a successful fanatic, you need a weapon. Which brings us to the third opportunity here, which is about his methodology.
Right. The piece sets up this really fascinating origin story about his time at the Library of Congress, but then it just drops it.
I noticed that. It says he started as a messenger and learned to collate material. It reads like a humble beginnings story, but it's not humble beginnings. It's the key to his entire power structure. The text even quotes a letter where Hoover himself says that job gave him the foundation for everything. But the draft just treats it like a fun fact.
So the weakness is that the author doesn't connect the skill of collating to the weapon of surveillance?
Precisely. We usually think of his power coming from his title or his political connections.
But you're saying the power came from the filing system?
Absolutely. Information architecture was his superpower. The author needs to thread this librarian concept through the whole piece. When the text talks about the Palmer raids in 1919, that's a list. It's a catalog of people.
So later, when we get to the investigation of subversion section, we should call back to that?
Explicitly. When the text describes the security index or the rabble-rouser index, the author should frame it as the ultimate expression of his library science background. He wasn't investigating crimes. He was categorizing the population. Safe, dangerous, subversive.
That's a chilling image. The whole country is a library, and he decides which books get burned.
And who controls the checkout list? Look at the Venona Project. The text says he kept those intercepts in a personal safe. He didn't even tell President Truman. That's the behavior of a librarian hoarding the special collection.
It also explains his longevity. You can fire a director, but you can't fire the guy who owns the catalog.
Exactly.
You know, this brings us to the issue of tone. Because the draft is so honest about the abuses, the blackmail, the racism, the wiretaps. It leans very, very heavily into a villain arc.
Which is factually supported, of course.
It is. But if he's presented as a pure monster from page 1, it creates this logic gap. The reader is left wondering, if he was this bad, why did the American public love him for 40 years?
That is the critical missing piece, the hero arc. The author needs to really bolster the public relations aspect of his career to explain the seduction. We need to see why he was so popular before we see him fall.
The text has the data for this. It mentions the FBI story movie and the TV show.
It mentions them, but it's just the list. We need to see the active manipulation. The text notes he was a consultant to Warner Brothers. The author should expand on that. Hoover wasn't just the subject of movies. He was the director of his own myth. He curated his image just like he curated his files.
There's that section on the Depression-era gangsters, Dillinger, Babyface Nelson. It mentions the Little Bohemia raid.
Which was a total disaster. An agent died, a bystander was shot, the whole gang got away.
Right.
But the text says he pulled out all stops afterward.
The author should use that moment to show his genius for spin. He took a failure and turned it into a mandate for more guns, more federal power. He used the war on crime to build the G-Man brand.
The man of science versus the chaotic criminal.
Exactly. If you build up that man of science pedestal in the 1930s, his fall into paranoia in the 1960s becomes a genuine tragedy, not just a crime log.
It's the corruption of an ideal. And the text has that great stat. At one point, it was harder to become an FBI agent than to get into an Ivy League college. That needs to be in the main flow. It explains the shield he had. He was untouchable because he'd convinced everyone he was the only thing standing between them and chaos.
And all these themes should converge. I'm thinking of the part where the text mentions Nixon wanted to fire him but was afraid.
Fear of reprisals. That's where it all comes together. If the author has done the work with the private life section earlier, the reader knows exactly what Nixon is afraid of.
He's afraid of the files, the blackmail.
Yes. Show that the tactic worked for 40 years. It worked on the mob, it worked on Kennedy, it worked on Nixon. It's the payoff for the librarian theme, too. The collection was finally complete, and it was pointed right at the president.
You know, that reminds me of the quote about the JFK investigation. The text has Hoover writing he wanted to convince the public that Oswald is the real assassin.
Such a heavy quote. Convince the public, not find the truth.
Right.
That belongs in the public relations thread.
He was still the director of the movie. He needed a clean ending for the script. He was a storyteller first and a cop second.
A storyteller with a badge and a gun.
Yeah. So let's talk about the ending. The current draft ends with the J. Edgar Hoover building and the efforts to rename it and the fact that it's deteriorating.
It's a bit on the nose, isn't it?
A little.
But it works. I think the suggestion is just to lean into that metaphor. The building is ugly, brutalist, and literally crumbling. It's a perfect stand-in for his reputation.
So just sharpen that imagery.
Yeah. Just as the concrete is falling off the headquarters, the myth of the G-Man has fallen away to reveal the coercion underneath.
That's a good wrap-up. So, looking at this, we're talking about a pretty comprehensive rewrite. Not of the facts, the submission is incredibly rich, but of the architecture.
The bricks are all there, but right now, it's a pile of bricks. We want a fortress. We want the private life to be the foundation of his vulnerability. We want Christian nationalism to be the framework of his aggression.
And the librarian methodology as the wiring that runs through every single room.
And we want the hero myth to be the paint on the outside that hides all the cracks.
I think we have a solid blueprint here. The submission is strong, but it could be really powerful.
It just needs to be brave enough to break the chronological silos. Don't protect the reader. Mix the sex, the politics, the religion all together. Because that's how they existed in Hoover's life.
So to recap the main action items for the rewrite. First, move the private life and blackmail details out of the footer and into the organized crime timeline to really explain his policy paralysis.
Second, introduce that Christian nationalism framework early on. Use it to explain the sheer ferocity of his attacks on civil rights leaders.
Third, use the librarian metaphor, collating and indexing, as a recurring theme to explain the true source of his power. And finally, balance that dark villain arc by showing how he constructed the hero myth through media manipulation and the man of science brand.
Exactly.
We invite you to tear down the current structure and rebuild it using these thematic pillars. It's a lot of work, but the story definitely deserves that level of integration. Submit the revised draft when you're done. We'd love to see how the narrative tension changes. Thanks for listening to The Critique.